Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, FreeSpeechTV, and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers and changemakers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, I'm joined by Cassandra Lopez, the Litigation Director at Otro Lado, a binational organization dedicated to protecting the rights and dignity of immigrants in Mexico and the United States. In this role, Cassandra litigates habeas corpus petitions on behalf of individuals in immigration detention and brings FOIA lawsuits to promote government transparency on a range of immigration issues. Welcome to the program, Cassandra.
Thank you for having me.
So Otro Lado, I understand, means on the other side. What is the significance of that? How do you describe your organization's main goals?
Well, we provide services to people on both sides of the border. So we're based here in San Diego, where I'm located, and in Los Angeles in Southern California. And then we also have offices in Tijuana and Mexico City. And we're really aiming to provide legal services to people that are facing detention and deportation in the United States, and then people that are migrants or have been deported and are on the Mexico side of the border. So we provide no-cost legal services and humanitarian assistance to people on both sides of the border and who are affected by the really cruel U.S. immigration policies. And our goal is to see freedom of movement and dignity in migration without the need for constant legal intervention to demand that basic human rights be upheld.
Is the fact that Otro Lado works on both sides of the borders part of what makes it unique? We have so many immigrant rights groups in the United States, but it seems as though most of them focus on immigrant rights for those people while they're here in the United States, and they don't really often have the capacity, or maybe they just keep their goals narrow and don't as much follow folks if and when they might be deported. Is the uniqueness of your organization the fact that it's cross-border?
Yes, I think that is one aspect of our work that makes us unique. So we are, as I said, providing legal services to people that are facing deportation or detention here in the United States, but then we're also aiming to provide services and support migrants that are either, stranded on the Mexican side of the border because of our asylum policies, say, or people that have been deported and need assistance or support reintegrating into Mexico, or perhaps, are deported to Mexico but are from another country and need services and support while they're in Mexico. And we really aim to provide services on both sides of the border. And we have lawyers in Mexico that work for the organization that can provide legal services in Mexico. And then also, can serve individuals that are still located in the United States.
It seems as though in recent years, maybe the last 10 or so years, even longer than that, the migrants who are on the southern side of the U.S.-Mexico border are not just Mexican nationals, right? They're Central Americans. They're even folks from Asia. Is that accurate? Or even Africa, I understand.
Yeah, we see people from really all over the world that are stranded on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border. People from Haiti, people from all over South Asia, people from Asia, people from Africa, and then also people obviously from all over Latin America. Many individuals previously arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border to apply for asylum through the CBP-1 app that now is canceled. It's no longer in existence due to the Trump administration's ending of that policy. But before, people were instructed to apply through CBP-1 at the southern border, and then when their appointments were months in the future, they were they were waiting in Mexico for their appointment to become current, and then oftentimes didn't have support, family, any real connection to Mexico. And so Al Otro Lado was able to provide services and support for individuals in that posture.
And what's the history of the organization? When was it founded, and why? The issue of immigration has really reared up since the Trump administration took power. But of course, we can look back through the history of the United States. Before Trump, there was the Bush administration and the post 9/11 era. Before that, there was lots of other things. But where in that timeline of U.S. government attacks on immigrants was Al Otro Lado founded, and why?
Yeah, so like you said, really, although we're seeing the Trump administration ramp up immigration enforcement and the use of things like immigration detention on a much broader scale that's had a tremendous negative impact on immigrants in the United States, really over the past several decades, there's been an increased criminalization of immigration and increased enforcement, resulting in increased deportations and the increased use of detention. So this isn't necessarily new under Trump. It's just ramped up to a new level. And Al Otro Lado was founded back in 2014, specifically here on the southern border, or in Southern California, close to the US-Mexico border. And the goal of the organization from the start was to support people that were facing crisis caused by the U.S. immigration laws and policies. And we were motivated or moved to act because of the negative consequences that we were seeing all around: deported parents left on the streets of Tijuana without support, asylum seekers who were unlawfully turned away at the ports of entry, children that were separated from families in the name of deterrence, people in immigration detention. We saw people with valid legal claims stranded without access to counsel. So all of those factors or realities moved the founders of Al Otro Lado, 3 women immigration attorneys and cross-border advocates, to come together and fill the gap in services that they really identified as being a big need here on the southern border, on the US-Mexico border. We began as a small volunteer-run legal clinic, providing free support to deported people and asylum seekers within hours of their arrival in Mexico. And from the beginning, our work has been grounded in a simple belief that access to protection should not depend on luck, geography, politics, or financial resources.
Are there specific programs outside of litigation that you are engaged in? I know that you are you work specifically on litigation, but on your website you show programs that are even more sort of basic things, like leaving water for immigrants, or ensuring that LGBTQ immigrants have rights and dignity. Can you go through some of the specific programs outside of litigation? Because litigation, of course, I guess comes, that's the end of the line, or it's when things enter the litigation issue, then people are, I guess, on the government's radar. It becomes far more official, becomes far more serious.
Yeah, so in the United States, our work involves a number of different programs to provide legal services to different individuals in different contexts. So we have a team that's focused on providing legal services to unaccompanied children. Those are kids that arrive at the port or at the border without a parent or legal guardian, and then they end up in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And under the law, regulations and a legal settlement, those children are entitled to certain legal services. And so we have lawyers and other support staff that are representing kids in that posture. Many of them are eligible for different forms of relief that have to do with the fact that they don't have a parent or legal guardian. We also provide legal services to people that were separated during the first Trump administration. There's a program that is the result of a lawsuit that was filed by the ACLU. And Al Otro Lado was a named plaintiff in that case, where basically the government agreed to provide services to people that were separated from their children under the first Trump administration. And so we run that program here at Otro Lado and provide some services to those individuals and then attempt to find pro bono legal representation for them. We also provide, like you mentioned, some humanitarian services here in Southern California. So we have our water drop program and our day laborer outreach program where we're, trying to meet people's real basic needs. And then on the Mexico side, we have clinics once a week in Tijuana where we really see, a range of different kinds of issues and questions that come up from people that are in Mexico. I think most of them have been deported, and they have questions about, are they going to be able to come back to the United States at any point in the future legally? And that, I think they just really see a range of different questions and are there to try to provide information to people so that they understand their rights and understand what protections they might have or what forms of relief that they might be able to access in the future to come back to the United States. So we really, provide a range of services to meet both the humanitarian needs and the legal needs of immigrants on both sides of the border.
I want to just step out of the organizational questions for a moment and ask you about the political work or the political aspect of it. In your experience, how different is the issue of immigrant rights under a president like Trump than, say, under a Democratic president, say just specifically Joe Biden? I think people think that attacks on immigrants exist mostly during Republican administrations. What have you seen?
I think, like I said at the beginning, for the past several decades, the politics around immigration in the United States has increasingly focused on both criminalization of non-citizens and increased enforcement. I think under President Obama, he took steps to try to provide relief to, say, children that came or to individuals that came as children. So that was DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That was an executive order. But at the same time, so that was an executive order that was trying to provide some form of regularization for people that had lived in the United States for their entire lives and they'd gone to school or, were, trying to move forward productively with their lives. It didn't guarantee a path to citizenship, and many of those people now are finding themselves in uncertain territory because the Trump administration is trying to eliminate every program really as much as possible. So, but at the same time, under Obama, there was increased enforcement, and they continued to criminalize individuals, say, for example, people that had been deported and came back to the United States. There was increased enforcement of that is a federal felony offense, and people are facing oftentimes months, years, sometimes in prison for that conduct. Trump has increased enforcement, and it's unprecedented, the amount of money that has been designated for immigration enforcement. And I think both under the first Trump administration and this administration, there's really this kind of like demonstration of cruelty that I think they relish in, both I think to provide deterrence so that people will ultimately say, you know what, I think I'm just going to self-deport. I'm just going to go back to my own country. This is, too unpleasant for me to stay here. But then also, ramping up enforcement of people that before under, say presidents like Obama or Biden weren't priority. So, I think we've seen this language around like, we're going to prioritize people that have, criminal records and, undesirable, folks, people that aren't, working and being productive and are, usually committing crimes. I think that's the language that's been used under prior administrations like Obama or Biden. We could quibble about, what does it mean to be, a criminal alien? But now Trump is really going after everybody. So these are all of the immigration raids that we've seen on the streets. And they've taken the position, the administration has, that if you're here in the United States and you entered without permission, that if you're detained by immigration, that you are subject to mandatory detention. So they've also really increased dramatically the use of immigration detention, and are trying to basically put everybody in detention, everybody that entered without permission. And that's an about face, a remarkable change from immigration law and policy as it existed before. People were eligible for bonds, could have a bond hearing before the immigration judge, and if they were not a flight risk or a danger, they would be granted bond. And now the Trump administration is saying anybody that entered without permission is subject to mandatory custody. Obviously, that makes things much more difficult for people to find a lawyer, to pay for a lawyer. Oftentimes the breadwinner is in custody. They're separated from their families. Many of these people have young children. Many of them have gainful employment, started businesses, have lived here, and really done everything to abide by the law and be productive members of their communities for years, sometimes decades. And the Trump administration has been arresting, rounding those folks up and detaining them. I think because the cruelty is the point with this administration with respect to immigration. So that's, I think, a marked change, is that they are making a big show of, how terrible they can be to, I think maybe appease their base that is opposed to immigration. And also, I think, to try to deter people from both coming to the United States and from staying here without permission.
Cassandra, I want to ask you about public opinion a little bit before we kind of move to the way in which Otro Lado engages in storytelling. In 2024, when Trump was running for office, public opinion polls showed a huge support for immigration enforcement, likely in response to the Trump campaign just hammering on the issue, saying that immigration was out of control and that immigrants were invading the United States, taking people's jobs, very much using this notion of, or using the reality of people's financial struggles to scapegoat immigrants. And then when the ICE raids were in full force in 2025 through the end of last year, especially with what happened in Minnesota, we saw public opinion really dramatically shift, where people felt that the Trump administration went too far and actually we didn't need that kind of harsh immigration enforcement. Does it frustrate you that public opinion can be so easily swayed? And how does an organization like yours do the narrative work, if at all, to ensure that ultimately this is always about human rights? We have a president who routinely dehumanizes immigrants and uses Nazi-like language to talk about them.
I mean, yes, it's really frustrating. I think that it's easy to scapegoat immigrants because they are, and they're not from the United States, and it's easy to blame them. You are not making enough money. We all know affordability has been a real issue, a growing issue over the past years. It's easy to point to immigrants and say, that's why immigrants are taking your jobs, or, immigrants are coming into your community and raising the cost of housing or making it harder to find a place to rent. But in reality, what I think we came to see during the increased enforcement last year is that all of us, live in communities, or many of us, most of us, and especially in cities, but really across the United States, rely on immigrants for all kinds of different reasons, right? Whether it's like working in the fields here in Southern California or in California, working in the agricultural industry, or, taking care of our older folks or our children, or, working in restaurants and doing jobs that are not that well paid and that are really challenging. And I think, so many stories that I've seen over the past year where, people are like, but this person, she lived in our community for decades and she had her kids and she was, worked at the local diner and we love her, not her. Like, we thought you were going to go after the bad guys, which I think, Trump was able to tell that story and others, not just Trump, but that, that in some ways, immigrants are equal bad guys. He's been saying that now for a decade, right? Like the undesirables and the I can't even remember the language that he's used, but like, the calling them murderers and rapists and sort of
that they are poisoning the blood of the nation. And, I can't even, some of the language I can't use on the air because it violates our FCC rules. It's that sad.
Right. So like really playing that up. But then so I think in people's, and maybe in some people's minds, they have this idea of like the undesirable immigrant. But then when it comes to the people that you might know that work at your local grocery store or that live down the street from you or that their kids go to your kids' school, then it changes, right? Those are people that and you know them to be decent people, or you know them to be people that, their kids or their families and don't want them to be suffering in the same way that, the enforcement actions have created. So I think there's a disconnect a bit from like the story about who immigrants are and then the reality that people experience with the people that they know, or the people that are in their community. And I also think Americans, we don't want in the United States, I don't think anybody wants like armed, masked police or Border Patrol agents roaming the streets and picking people up and throwing them into unmarked cars and detaining them without any due process. And so I think that's what we've seen with the Trump administration's immigration policies, I think, in the past year, is that they've really overplayed their hand and taken things to an extreme that most Americans don't support. I think that, it seems like Americans do want there to be border enforcement and some type of, process by which people can apply to come to the United States and be screened and inspected. We don't have a system where that is easy to do unless you're rich. So that's, also in just seeing people's comments and, sometimes reading the comments on news articles or other things, you routinely see people like saying things like, why didn't they come the right way? Like, she was here for 25 years. Why didn't she become a citizen? She should have applied to become a citizen. She should have applied to get legal status, or she should have stood in line and waited the right way. And the reality is that there oftentimes is no line to stand in. It's just a closed door. And then other times too, there is no option for somebody to, say, apply to become a citizen if they've lived here for 3 decades. Because if they come across the border without permission, that's it. You can't apply to get legal status once you're here in the United States. So I think also people don't often understand how difficult it is to become, to get a visa, to become a resident and a citizen here in the United States, unless you have money, unless you have a good job, unless you have, if you're married to a US citizen, that could be a pathway. But for the most part, people that are, living outside the United States, there really aren't very many doors for them to be able to come to the United States legally.
Right. And of course, the president has unveiled his gold card, which is his version of a green card for extremely wealthy international elites, literally saying it's okay for you to come into this country without any other, the only difference between a wealthy person being able to come in and somebody with very little money is the money.
Exactly.
So it's so overt, in spite of the fact that there is growing public discontent over billionaires and anger over the financial scarcity people live in. I want to just once more ask you specifically about the border aspect of it. How do you tell the stories? I mean, some of us believe that we should live in a world without borders, that if capital can cross borders without needing paperwork, why can't people? This is, as you were pointing out earlier, a little bit controversial because a lot of Americans still feel this, I guess, nationalism that requires or leads them to believe that the border needs enforcement. Does Otro Lado talk about your values around the existence of a border and how that is used as a weapon against people?
I think, yeah, we do. And I think there may be varying opinions. I can't speak for everyone at the organization as to how they feel about having a border. I think that most people at the organization feel like the border is a destructive and dehumanizing reality. And like you said, doesn't encompass or take into consideration the fact that capital and other resources cross borders. So it makes sense that people do too. But I think more importantly, we have to contend with the fact that the border does exist. Not only, theoretically, but like if you're down here in San Diego, the borders, there's several walls. They're large. There's, it looks like a militarized zone. There's concertina wire and, lights and cameras and helicopters and, agents driving around in ATVs or other, Border Patrol vehicles. So the border is very real here. And I don't know how useful it is to be telling a story, in my opinion, that the border shouldn't exist, because it does exist right now. So what I aim to do is to use storytelling, to use my client stories to expose the ways that the system, the immigration system or the border has a dramatic and really terrible impact on real people and real families and real lives, in an effort not just to evoke sympathy, but to expose the way that the systems harm people and in an attempt to hold the system accountable. So, I might tell my client stories in legal filings to humanize them and to individualize them before a system that's inherently dehumanizing. So if, in my experience, it doesn't do me any good to go into court and say, the border shouldn't exist, we should have an open border.
Right.
Because
no, of course.
the judge isn't going to hear that. And also, I don't know, it's just not, it doesn't move my ball forward. It doesn't help me with my client, whatever I'm trying to get done for him.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Cassandra. Good luck to you and to your allies.
Thank you.
My guest has been Cassandra Lopez, Litigation Director at Otro Lado, and this is Rising Up for Justice. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of FreeSpeechTV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.